the right to a free press. If you violate that right, you automatically impinge on the very basic human right to free speech. Because if you gag journalists, then it sends a message to other people that if they publish or air their grievances, then they too might be punished. If you have that climate of fear, people won't be allowed to say what they want. They won't feel safe and protected to say what they feel they need to say. And what happens is you have a society that hides things under a rug. Harms that are done to society, they will all be hidden from sight because nobody wants to speak out. And what happens is you have a government or people in power who feel emboldened to further commit such wrongs against society, and you don't have any checks and balance. That will lead to even more violations of human rights, because if you have a government who feels that they can do whatever they want, then what's to stop a government from thinking they can just steal the money of the people, or a government who feels that they can just arrest anyone they think is their enemy?
You're tuned in to Fast Forward, where we talk about the future of the many professional fields that shape our lives. It's Fifi Lopez, and today we will look at the state of journalism post-COVID-19. Aside from some health and safety protocols, we will discuss what's going on with ABS-CBN, Rappler, as well as Sky Cable, and its connection to press freedom, with our esteemed guest. She is a multimedia reporter at Rappler, Philippines, currently serving as a Malacanang Palace correspondent. She began writing news on national politics in 2016 when she covered the presidential elections and eventually started reporting on the Philippine president. Before she set foot in the Pasig-based media outlet, she was a scriptwriter-producer for a late-night GMA news program. This Ateneo de Manila University AB Communication magna cum laude graduate is here to give insight into the lives of media practitioners. She is Pia Ranada.
Welcome to the show, Miss Pia. Thank you so much for being here. Before we delve into the many challenges that surround your line of work, I'd like to know more about your experiences as a Rappler reporter. You cover the Malacanang beat, but President Rodrigo Duterte hasn't allowed you to enter the palace ever since Feb 20, 2018. So what was your initial reaction when you found out about this ban?
Hi, Sophia. Thank you so much for having me in your podcast. So first of all, about the ban. This ban was, I think, 2 years old already. I was banned in 2018. Until now, I remain unable to enter Malacanang. Obviously, because of the pandemic, no one really is allowed to enter. But for me, it's more than that. The Malacanang itself saying that we are no longer accredited with the palace as media. But funnily enough, I'm still able to ask questions during Harry Roque's press briefings. They still acknowledge us as a news organization. It's just that I'm not allowed to physically enter Malacanang. I'm still a Malacanang reporter because I continue to report on the president, and Malacanang Press Corps still considers me as a member. So far, I haven't really changed my output. You can still read my stories about the president. You can still read my reports and my in-depth reports. You still hear me asking questions to the government, especially to the spokesperson of the president. So that hasn't changed.
I'd also like to add that what doesn't add up is that a lot of politicians weighed in, but they haven't put a finger on the exact reason or the exact violation that Rappler has made to warrant the said ban. So why do you think you were banned from entering the palace in the first place?
It was really the report we wrote about Senator Bongo, who was then a presidential aide, and his involvement in this Navy frigates deal is a very big project of the government. It was 16 billion worth. The article was really about Bongo, and we know that the president is very loyal to his aide, especially this person, Senator Bongo. And I guess he felt that the story hit too close to home. It dismayed him very much, and this story progressed to the point that the Senate even called a hearing about the findings of the report. And obviously the hearing, in a way, was meant to vindicate Bongo because many people stood up for him, and the whole point of the Senate hearing was to basically destroy the credibility of the article, even if the article cited documents and also government official statements and the fact that we asked for Bongo's side. The story in itself is fair. We got both sides of the officials, right? We got Bongo's side and we also had to cite our documents. But still, the president felt that the article was too sensitive. After the Senate hearing, the day after that was when he ordered the presidential security group to prohibit me from entering Malacanang. And the funny thing is, a few months later, he himself would admit to his role in this deal, in the Navy frigates deal. So it basically he proved our story right. We were saying that Malacanang intervened in the deal, and Duterte naman admitted that yes, in fact, he did step in because he got a complaint from one of the suppliers and he had to look into the concern. And that's something that Malacanang typically doesn't do, right? It doesn't really step into deals, especially when the deals are already protected, they're already being implemented. So it was something that we felt was a public interest issue, something which we think people might be interested to know about, especially because it involves billions of taxpayers' money.
In other words, you were just simply doing your job of shedding light on what's happening in our country.
Yes.
It's just terrifying that the politicians, the people up there have not only put that ban up, but extended that ban to all Rappler employees, which means that no one from Rappler can cover presidential events. So has there been any update on whether or not this ban will be lifted?
No update yet for Malacanang, but on our end, Rappler has filed a Supreme Court petition hoping to declare the ban as unconstitutional because it impinges on right to free speech but also to due process, because Malacanang was never clear about the grounds for the ban. Like you said, officials have a hard time even saying what we did wrong to merit the policy. And, we've never seen any written document about it. There doesn't seem to be any legal ground for this policy, and yet it's implemented. And for us, that the very implementation of this ban is already harmful to society, because now, like, you can have another president saying, oh, look what Duterte did. He was able to ban a reporter with a very flimsy basis. So it might give them the idea to do it again and again to other news groups or other journalists in the future. And we think this is a real harm to our freedom of the press.
That's very true. Even Turkey, China, and to some extent, the United States is feeling its own violation of press freedom. But I guess the silver lining here is that we still have people like you who are fighting to defend the truth amidst this pandemic. As you know, the ABS-CBN shutdown, as well as the conviction on cyber libel of Rappler CEO Maria Ressa, as well as writer-researcher Ray Santos Jr., has made a lot of reporters think twice about putting out critical content. This is definitely a violation of press freedom, but not all Filipinos understand this concept. So can you tell us why press freedom is a basic human right?
Yung right to press freedom is the right of the press, right? You have it if you're a member of the press. It's fundamentally related to our right of free speech, right? Anyone should be able to say what they want, to express themselves without fear of reprisal, without fear of a crackdown or any other consequence, just because they want to say what they feel. Their grievances, their dissent, especially when it comes to how they're governed. So the right to a free press, if you violate that right, you automatically impinge on the very basic human right to free speech. Because if you gag journalists, then it sends a message to other people that if they publish or air their grievances, then they too might be punished. If you have that climate of fear, people won't be allowed to say what they want. They won't feel safe and protected to say what they feel they need to say. And what happens is you have a society that hides things under a rug. Harms that are done to society, they will all be hidden from sight because nobody wants to speak out. And what happens is you have a government or people in power who feel emboldened to further commit such wrongs against society. And you don't have any checks and balance. That will lead to even more violations of human rights, because if you have a government who feels that they can do whatever they want, then what's to stop a government from thinking they can just steal the money of the people, or a government who feels that they can just arrest anyone they think is their enemy?
I'd also like to add that it is the government's duty to serve us, and it is our duty to make them understand whether or not they are doing their job. Also, the freedom of the press is under our constitution, but even though this is part of our constitution, there has been a lot of violations of this. For example, ABS-CBN has been shut down last May 4 despite its following the law. Why do you think the government allowed the ABS-CBN shutdown to happen?
It's been very clear that the government likes to send its messages by zeroing in on certain institutions that it feels represent certain sectors of society. It likes to make an example out of people. So rather than punish everyone, it will just choose someone, one person or one entity, and it will make an example out of that person, because by doing that, the other people will feel scared. And achieving this climate of fear is easier when you just do it on one person. So I think that's what's been happening. And we've been experiencing this in Rappler also, diba? Like at the start of the administration, we saw the government cracking down on our organization. And when that didn't work, it seemed that they are now throwing the spotlight on ABS-CBN. So I think that it's just a way to send a message. And so far, they're succeeding because, when you look at the ABS-CBN shutdown, you think of the thousands of workers who won't be able to go to work. And the other media workers out there who work for other companies might be fearing the same reprisal. Their organization is critical of the administration, then they might expect this kind of punishment, and they could expect maybe that they will lose their job. And it's so hard to not have a job these days because we have a pandemic where so many industries are shutting down, so many people are unemployed, so people will cling to their jobs more. For me, it's like the government is basically sending a message to tame the media. We know that media in the Philippines is typically very vibrant. Diba? We have one of the most vibrant media landscapes in Southeast Asia because our journalists usually have been very free to write what they want, to say what they feel will protect the public. So right now, that kind of freedom, that vibrant media landscape is under attack.
I'd like to go back to what you said, that Rappler has similarly been affected by this crackdown on journalists. For the longest time, Rappler has been accused of being foreign-owned. Some politicians have stated that there are foreigners who own Philippine Depository Receipts or PDRs. Therefore, these foreigners own part of Rappler. This is definitely not the case because, right, it's kind of like betting on a horse. When you do that, you don't own the horse, but you profit when the horse wins. So can you tell us why the problem that Rappler is going through right now is a political concern and not a legal one?
You're right about PDRs being not a form of ownership, but it's just a way to invest, to help media companies stay afloat, because obviously media companies also need a source of income, right? We need funding so that we can continue our operations. And in the Philippines, it's very hard to run a media company. And other companies like ABS-CBN, GMA, all of them have PDRs that allow entities to infuse capital or funds into them so that they can continue operations. So that's not ownership, and that's not illegal. We have so many other companies doing it. Why is this a political issue? It's a political issue because we have someone powerful, an elected official, the president, making moves towards these groups, these organizations that are critical of him. So it's political because he's using his power, his executive power, to bear down on these institutions. In democracies, media is the fourth estate. We're here to watch the government, and we're here to give voice to people in our country who are left powerless or who are harmed by government policies. And we can't do that job if our existence is threatened. And it seems that under this presidency, we have a chief executive who has no qualms about using his powers to intimidate the media. So definitely it's political. It's also legal, right? Just because something is a political issue doesn't mean it's not legal. It's not a legal issue because obviously we have cases involved, we have legal cases, we have the Supreme Court involved, we have judiciary involved. So it's a legal issue. But you also have to realize that it's something that we see a lot of authoritarian-like regimes do. What they do is use legality to try to target institutions like Rappler or ABS-CBN. They try to use legal loopholes so that these companies get shut down or aren't able to function fully.
It's also pretty terrifying that our leaders can do this to big media organizations. What more when they try to take down, let's say, an alternative press outfit or a campus newspaper? Another problem that could hurt our democracy is the anti-terror bill. This has been passed last July 3, and it has made human rights violations such as illegal detention, wiretapping based on mere suspicion, as well as censorship of dissent legal. With that, what are the implications of the anti-terror law on our democracy?
It has huge implications because, number one, it expands the kinds of crimes that can be punished under the anti-terrorism law. So one of these crimes is inciting to terrorism, and the definition of inciting to terrorism includes expressing support for a terrorist organization or calling for a terroristic act through writing emblems or slogans or anything or any published material. So it just means that if the government thinks that your form of speech is a way of inciting to terrorism, then you can already be punished under this law. And the scary thing about that is the group that gets to decide that is the cabinet, basically, cabinet members in the executive branch. So that's scary because obviously these people are controlled by the president. They're alter egos of the president, who is a political figure and who might have enemies, right, who he wants to crack down on. In the past, a prescription for a terrorist group would only come from the court. So that's still the case here. Court still has to prescribe a group as a terrorist group. But what this new law allows is for this anti-terrorism council to ask for a preliminary prescription from the court. And the law doesn't even require this prescription for the council to order an arrest or a surveillance on a certain person. So it's something very worrisome. I think that it gives a lot of power to the executive branch. Even if it's just a preliminary prescription, it provides in a way a shortcut that wasn't there before. That's very alarming, and a lot of legal minds are trying to question this new law in the Supreme Court. So we will just have to see what the Supreme Court will do about this.
I'd like to emphasize what you said, that this law can categorize dissenters as terrorists. How do you think this law will affect news reporting, especially right now when journalists are being blamed for hurting patriotism and pride for the Philippines?
It has a very alarming definition of terrorism because they have a clause there that exempts rallies and protests. But that provision also includes a caveat that the only kinds of protests and rallies that are exempt from being punished by the law are those protests and rallies that do not endanger public safety. So what's scary about this is, what if the council will just say, oh, this protest endangers public safety? So they can define that. They have the power to define that under the implementing rules and regulations, which they are going to come up with on how they would define endangering to public safety. It's a very critical definition because what if endangering to public safety just means criticizing the president? Because then it's like you're trying to oust the government. They could play around with this definition, and even if the government right now says that they won't do it, what's to stop the next administration or another president maybe 10 years down the road who has his own agenda or who has not so noble intentions? What if they decide to abuse this particular law? So it's very easy for the government now to say it won't be abused, but can they really speak for future presidents? Can they really speak for future anti-terrorist council members?
This law is very vague. It backs a lot of dissenters into a corner and pushes them to stay silent. So how do you think this law will compel media practitioners to self-censor themselves?
It's definitely a cloud hanging over anyone who will write critically of the government, because we've been seeing so many people who are just airing their grievances being tagged as communists already. Like we have Sister Mary Jane Mananzan, who was recently labeled as a supporter of quote-unquote communist terrorist organization by a government official, a PCOO undersecretary. So if you have people throwing around these accusations, then there's a real fear, there's a real worry that these threats can translate into actual efforts by the Anti-Terrorism Council to actually arrest these kinds of dissenters. And under that definition, it could be a cause of concern that anyone who just has a legitimate concern or dissent or criticism of the government will already be labeled as a terrorist because they're quote-unquote helping or boosting communist propaganda.
As you said, it has been a long-used formula that politicians will use the word communist or terrorist to describe critics or people that don't agree with their policies. It can't be denied that a lot of forces will affect the actions of journalists who are frontliners right now doing their best to defend the truth amidst this pandemic. As much as possible, they are advised to work from home, but not everyone has this option because not all jobs can be done remotely. That's why some media practitioners have to go out into the field to catch a story. Since this produces great risk, what are some health and safety protocols that journalists must follow?
Definitely to wear a mask all the time, even when talking to people. When you're out and you're trying to get the story, you obviously have to interview officials and even possibly patients, right, in hospitals. So it's important that you wear a mask and as much as possible observe distance. But as much as possible, for example, in Rappler, we try to do interviews virtually to protect not only us but the interviewee and his family. So we do Zoom meetings or Zoom interviews or Skype calls. So it's only when we really have to go to the field that we actually step out of our houses. To protect our families, we also have to quarantine ourselves, stay away from our family members, especially if there's someone vulnerable in our house, like we have to maybe live in another room or another establishment altogether. And it's also about disinfecting your clothes after going out in the field. Basic things like that that everyone is asked to do. We just do them.
This pandemic will warrant a lot of changes for reporters as well as anyone working outside. But of course, we have to power through that so that reporters will do their best to inform people right now, especially with a lot going on. Aside from wearing PPEs and practicing physical distancing, reporters must now be accustomed to online pressers. Here, government agencies require reporters to send in their questions hours before an interview, and follow-up questions are not entertained. Why do you think this is so?
Definitely, it's one of the ways to guard against spreading the disease through a physical press conference. With the easing of restrictions, I think government is now starting to allow press conferences again. But I guess what's important to point out is, yes, you're right, the emergence of these virtual press conferences has severely hampered access because usually you need to follow up about the responses. If without the back and forth, it's very easy for them to just give a non-answer and then move on to the next question. You can't press them further for a better answer. You can't clarify what they mean. They can easily say something false and it'll be hard to correct them immediately. I think that the government can do a better job in making these press conferences more transparent and more effective, give them a chance to participate in the call and actually ask more than one question to the official. And at the same time, maybe resume certain press conferences with the imposition of social distancing and mask wearing.
Since you've mentioned that not all reporters will get the answers they need from these online pressers, how will the filtering of questions affect news reporting?
It's a big effect because one part of it is obviously the moderator will say there's no time to ask all these questions because you have to understand that there are many journalists who want to ask a question and we understand there's a time limit, right? It's usually in a show format where they can only fit questions within 30 minutes or so. So that's understandable, but you can't help but also fear that there might be sort of screening going on, right? Like screening of questions because there are questions that don't get read, and I have a lot of journalist friends who complain that my question wasn't read out. And another problem here is a lot of times they gather questions way before the press conference, but during the opening statement, the official already answered the question, but they would still ask the question. So the official would say, "Oh, but I already answered that earlier." Problem here is obviously the reporter didn't know that the official would answer the question in his opening statement. There's no chance for that reporter to maybe send a follow-up question. That's a big flaw in the way these press conferences are formatted, and I'm really hoping that the government can adjust or just make it more transparent. And if they can't do that, then maybe they can just make a rule where the officials will really be more proactive in responding to reporters' queries because we still naman send them Viber messages or we still text them our questions, and they could just be more willing to answer those queries, then I think it would even out the problems with access.
It is also the government's responsibility to allow these questions because, of course, the people want to know what's going on in their country. So I hope that they consider that fact. Since there are a lot of questions that are left unanswered, how can reporters resolve these gaps of information?
One way is to pester the official. for a response. So that's something we all do. We try to call them or we text them multiple times for an answer, try to convince them of the value of responding to our questions, the value to people's knowledge that they're helping answer certain pressing questions that citizens might have. But it's also being more resourceful, like looking for documents that are available, trying to source documents or information from other platforms or other formats of information. So it's just about being extra resourceful now and trying to look for other ways to confirm certain things. The government is able to upload certain documents that could already yield a lot of answers, and then it would just be a matter of following up with officials involved to confirm certain details or to clarify certain details.
Journalists must really have to be resourceful right now, especially when the administration is making it hard for them to do their job. What's even worse is that right now, a lot of fake news is spreading on social media. Journalists must now debunk these myths. How hard would it be for reporters to stop misinformation while reporting on current events right now?
Obviously, the pandemic feeds on a lot of misinformation, right? People are scared, they're paranoid. So people who spread fake news tend to exploit this to be able to make more hits, to have more views. Doubly important for news organizations now to issue these fact checks, especially when we have government officials who might be issuing misleading information or information that is meant to sort of sanitize certain lapses that they've had with the with the pandemic response. Right now in Rappler, for example, it's inbuilt in us reporters to immediately fact check an official if they cite misleading figures. Like when we live tweet the press conference, we also have to include in our tweet of what he said. When we write the article, we automatically call out the person, we call out the official, like, hey, this is false information, or this figure has more context and he failed to point out this context. In Rappler, we also have a dedicated fact-checking unit that receives complaints from netizens when they spot fake news. So we automatically churn out the fact checks for these.
It's not only the responsibility of media practitioners to stop misinformation, but also our responsibility as media consumers. So how can the whole society do its part in stopping fake news in its tracks?
One real way is on a very basic level to correct fake news when they see it on their feeds. Obviously, we have friends who are coming from different ideologies or whatnot, or political beliefs, and every political ideology, there are always fake news to bolster their version of events. If you see fake news in your feeds, automatically correct your friend who posted that, right? You say, no matter what their political loyalties may lie, that, hey, that's fake, diba? It's false, it's misleading, it's harmful. Don't be scared to comment. Or if you think that this person is very sensitive, then maybe you can directly message them first and say, hey, maybe what you posted isn't accurate and maybe you should check before posting. So little things like that, using our own personal networks to get rid or to weed out fake news from the internet is already a big help. But also defending journalists is also a big help because it's our job to do fact checks, and whenever someone tries to destroy our reputation without basis, that's a very big blow to our credibility.
In other words, the media producers as well as the media consumers must come together to stop fake news, to give more power to the press. Of course, we also have to defend press freedom because this is a basic tenet of democracy in our country. Before I let you go, would you like to address a message to fellow media practitioners?
I guess I would like to encourage all journalists, not just in the Philippines but worldwide, to come together to unify because this pandemic is really taxing us. It's very hard to cover this pandemic. It's very tiring, it's very stressful, frustrating, and traumatic. But this is the perfect time to come together and not fight each other and to work together to fact check or hold our governments accountable for whatever lapses they have done that has been harmful to society. And I guess especially now with the moves against ABS-CBN, it's really about standing up for each other. An attack on one is an attack against all, and we all need to band together and to show unity and not let petty competition or petty quarrels get in the way of the larger goal of protecting our industry, of protecting our craft. And I think that it's time to go beyond the petty arguments and quarrels that we usually problematize over. Let's get past that because there's a bigger problem and a bigger crisis that we all have to deal with together.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pia Ranada, for sharing your thoughts on the world of journalism post-COVID-19. If you like this episode, then feel free to subscribe wherever you are listening to. Don't forget to tune in next week because I upload new videos or episodes every Monday. That's all for now. It's Fifi Lopez saying goodbye and take care.